大家好，这是北美刘忙，今天是2021年的5月18号，今天是一个星期二。那今天出了一个和建商有关的经济数据，那什么呢？就是美国4月的这个新屋开建，那这个数字呢，同比锐减9.5%，那年化数字降至156.9万栋，经济学家预计是这个170万栋，所以是远不及预期。那同时呢，今天市场上出了几个这个零售方面公司的财报 ，Q1 的财报做的都不错，比如说这个加德堡 Home Depot， 然后沃尔玛，还有这个梅西百货，这些都是今天出了啊。那关于4月新建屋数字不及预期呢，路透社今天也进行了报道，同时对这个相关人士进行了采访。那华盛顿抵押银行家协会首席经济学家迈克尔他说，由于木材和其他投入物的成本显著增加，建筑商推迟了新建筑的开工。由于供应市场的改善和较低的抵押贷款利率对购房的强烈需求，这些供应链的限制阻碍了原本应该加快速度的房地产市场这也是现在市场的一个风险。也昨天的这个摩根士丹利也是说了有一些公司他们没有办法很快的把这个更高的消费传达给他们的这个顾客那也许建商现在就遇到了这个问题，你这个木头成本价太高，然而一些建商也许并不能很快的把这个更高的消费传达给他们的顾客，所以今天这个建商的 ETF XHB 也是下降了2.3%也是因为这个数据的问题。来看一下美国今天各大指数，标普500下跌0.85%，道琼斯下跌0.78%，纳斯达克下跌0.56%，纳斯达克100下跌0.72%。看一下11个标普板块，其中9个是跌的，有2个是涨的。跌的最凶的是能源跌了2.63%，把昨天的这个利润回吐。然后是工业跌了1.47%，金融跌了1.35%，通讯跌了1.23%，材料跌了1.09%，科技跌了0.82%。那涨得最多的是房地产，涨了一点点，涨了0.17%，医疗保健呢涨了0.05%。看一下今天标普500的热力图，一片红，今天的 fan 也全部是红的。微软跌了0.86%，苹果跌了1.13%，谷歌跌了1.16%， Facebook 脸书跌了1.74%，亚马逊跌了1.17%。那今天盘中的时候，这个半导体和半导体仪器都在科技中领涨，但是后来市场在那个收盘前进行了跳水。来看标普500日 K 相比粉色的 VIX 恐慌指数，今天恐慌指数也有一个比较明显的上涨今天这根大阴柱阴柱实体比较长，今天这个空头又占据了这个市场。那要看，其实昨天也是说了，小摩认为这个市场下跌还没有结束咱们要看它如果继续向下跌要做好准备。那这个是纳斯达克100，形态和标普500非常的像同时它的价格也是在20日和50日均线以下。那今天这个视频的标题也写了，我会讲这个美国的可选择消费品这个板块的 ETF。那现在要注意的是什么呢当然我们说标普的这个可选择消费品 ETF 它的符号是 XLY， 那当然这个也是我最喜欢的一款之一，紫色的这个 XLY， 这是标普自己出的。然后还有就是 Vanguard 的这个 VCR 这个是他们的可选择消费品板块，里面有200多只股票，那相比标普这个只有60多只股票是多了很多就和这当时讲的那个金融的 ETF 一样，也是 Vanguard它出的这里面不只包括标普500里面的大盘股，也有中小盘股，所以它里面有200多只股票，就是这根红色的 VCR 好吧。那我着重想说的是什么呢？是这个蓝色的这根叫RCD， 那这根是这个 Invesco 出的 RCD， 这个是标普500Equal Weight Consumer Discretionary， 那也就是说它这里面还是那个标普500里面的60多只这个可选择消费品的股票，但它们的权重是相同的。是什么意思呢？我们来看这个 Consumer Discretionary 它的问题是什么这个就是这个板块，问题是它的权重有1/3都在亚马逊，同时有很大的权重在特斯拉。然后我们来看这个 Travel， 整个旅游的板块就这么小这个整个服饰的板块就这么点，然后旅馆的板块只有这么点，饭店的板块这么一点，所以它这里面有很多的股票没有办法来带动整个板块的表现，整个板块就看这几个加德堡、Tesla、Amazon， 对不对？他们就能撼动整个板块。所以我跟大家说这个 equal weight 这个 equal weight RCD 我觉得现在很有趣因为现在我们老说经济重启股里面很多有趣的经济重启股都在这个板块，但是他们占比太小了。OK， 回来这边看一下表现，咱们把时间调到2020年1月份左右，疫情来之前的这个位置来看一下表现。很明显，上面这个红色的 Vanguard VCR 这一个涨了 51%， 那其他的两个这个 RCD 和 XLY 他们的表现都不如Vanguard都是在 30% 左右也就说明从疫情前到现在，这个 total market 这个整体市场中大小盘相加的这个整体的可选择消费品表现是好过这两个标普500可选择消费品的表现的。同时我们看到这个标普500可选择消费品相同权重的这个 RCD， 疫情来的时候它跌得最凶跌得最凶。那我们如果把时间调到这个底部，疫情来之后的这个底部，我们看到谁涨得最好？ RCD这个标普500相同权重的这个 ETF 涨了 151%， 然后 VCR Vanguard 的这个涨了 130%， 标普的 XLY 板块涨了 93%。 那我们把时间调到2021年的年初今年开年的时候，我们看到 RCD 相同权重标普500涨了 21.51%， 红色的 VCR 涨了 10.09%， 然后 XLY 标普可选消费品板块涨了 6.07%。 我们如果来看这个 RCD Invesco 这个 ETF， 它里面的股票就是60多只，就是那标普500里面的60多只。但是我们如果来看它这个 percent of fund， 就是它在这个 ETF 里面的权重都是在 2% 以下，1.9%、1.8%、1.8%、1.75%、1.6%是比较平衡的。然后你看我们这个特斯拉在这个 ETF 里面只占 1.28%， AbbZ 只占 1.15%， 然后这边这个 Amazon 只占 1.62%。也就是说能够给投资者提供一个更全面的一个曝光，对于真正的美国可选的消费品因为它不是只看市值来断定你的权重所以这个很有趣，就想给大家分享一下。那好，咱们来看一下今天一些华尔街对这个股市的解读。首先带来的是摩根大通全球市场策略师Gabriel Santos。Join
us now to talk about what's working in the markets. Gabriela Santos, global market strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management. You and Druck with the financials, Gabriela, Stanley Druckenmiller. It's some pretty good company. But so explain how they're not mutually exclusive, I guess, tech and financials. But how does it factor into your thinking?
That's right. Good to be with you, Joe. So I think what's really working in the markets is to realize that we've entered a third phase here of this new market cycle. The first was all about the virtual world from March to early November. Then we started a new phase from early November to early April, all about the return of the real world. And now we're in a third phase where we're thinking a lot more about the expansion. What do the next few years look like? There is going to be a moderation in growth coming back with the U.S. economy settling back to its more normal growth pace of 2%. So that's where something like technology and growth themes come back into play. A second aspect of the new cycle is a lot more upside risk to inflation, something we have not had over the past decade, that argues for continued steeper curves. That's where a sector like financials comes into play as a way to hedge against inflation and tap into this change in the cycle. And then there's a third aspect to this also, which is thinking about where in other markets we're still in an earlier phase of the market cycle where enthusiasm for the recovery is just starting to build. And this is where we come to the conclusion that it makes sense to have an overweight at this moment to more cyclical regions like Europe and Japan, so to complement this U.S. exposure as well.
A couple of times.
那这个人说，现在咱们进入的是这个市场周期的第3个阶段，它里面说了前2个阶段是什么呢？第一个阶段是去年3月份到11月，这个是虚拟世界的阶段，然后去年11月到今年4月是重返现实阶段。那现在就是4月份到现在，咱们进入了这个是扩展阶段。那他认为科技和成长股慢慢又会被市场重视起来。 那同时我们看到了这个通胀的问题，那他认为金融板块是对这个通胀问题的一个很好的对冲。那当然不要忘了他是摩根大通啊，他本来他自己就是金融啊。他说同时可以考虑买入一些欧洲股票和日本股票，他认为这两个地区为比较周期性的地区。
We've seen that some of the biggest winners during the pandemic, they've seen a little bit of disappointment in how, I don't know, I'm thinking of maybe a Netflix or a Disney or something. You would think Disney's the greatest reopening play in the world, and yet Disney Plus still affects what happens with the stocks. They all seem maybe, you could make the case that they've gotten ahead of themselves. Although some, as you point out with technology, they're going to keep the gains made during the pandemic and just add to them from here on out. But they've all run up a lot. You need to factor that into your thinking.
I think so. I mean, it comes to the point where you do need to consider valuations once again. And I think we're really at a phase where it's, we're talking broad sectors here, tech, financials, but it really becomes much more of an intra-sector conversation. Where are valuations attractive or not based on each individual stock? Which companies are competitive in this new expansion or not? Which ones are price takers? Which ones are price setters? So we're really in a much more mid-cycle mature phase where it's really a lot more about intra-sector, company-by-company differentiation. At least here in the U.S., where we're in a much more advanced phase of the market cycle.
那主持人问他说，你看现在科技股和这个一些经济重启股，比如迪士尼，它已经涨得这么多了，尤其是去年我们看到涨得非常高，是不是太贵了？那他说他同意，他觉得这个估值，股票的估值很重要，同时我们要看这些公司有没有竞争力，同时我们要去断定一个公司它是这个价格接受者还是价格制定者啊，这个也很重要。然后他认为我们现在正在处于这个中期周期的成熟阶段。
What would you say that the next year's multiple looks like on tech or the NASDAQ or just in general? And is it a reasonable multiple? Because that point's been made to me that 22, 23 is not really, that out of line given the prospects for the group.
Yeah, so we have been thinking that this is going to really be a year where earnings catch up to the multiple. Last year was all about multiple expansion, all about expectations of future improvement. This year, it's all about reality catching up to those expectations. So we're really growing into the multiple from last year. So we do expect the multiple to come down a bit. For example, for the S&P 500, we're at 22 times. That multiple should be coming down as the year progresses. We saw that with the first quarter earnings season, for example. You had a big improvement going into the season, huge beats both on the top line and the bottom line, and yet the stocks didn't react. That's a sign really that these companies are growing into their advanced multiple, and we should expect that to continue. Second quarter earnings season is going to be amazing. We're just not going to get that big bang for our buck in terms of the actual stock reaction. So some multiple contraction this year, but there's a limit to how far the multiple falls given how low interest rates go.
那主持人问他说，你认为这个今年的这个 multiple 倍数，就是这个 PE 整个市场的这个估值市盈率，怎么样啊？那他说他认为这个收入，咱们这个每个公司的每股收益，他们正在想办法赶上他们这个估值，因为咱们这个估值有点高啊，标普500现在估值22，那他们的这个每股收益需要赶上，不然这个22稍微有一些高。那我们看到了 Q1 很多公司他们的这个财报都非常的棒，但是对他们的股价貌似没有一个很大的影响，这是为什么呢？这是因为去年我们给他们这些公司很多的高估值，他们需要在这个财报上来跟进这个估值，对不对？你光给他高估值，他这个每股收益不涨的话，你这个股市就有问题了，对吧？所以他也说这个 Q1 这个现象是这么一个原因。同时他觉得下一个季度 Q2 这些公司的财报还会非常的棒，但是股价也许还会像 Q1 一样没有太大的动静。那当然原因也是一样，想要去证明来证实他们现在这个高的 PE 这个估值是应该的。所以今年我们应该能看到一个整体市场市盈率的一个收缩，就是股价不怎么动，或者动的不多，但是这些公司他们的这个收益非常的高，净利润非常的高。 来是 PE 下降。那我们来看一下这个富国银行证券高级银行分析师 Mike Mayo 怎么说现在这个金融板块或者银行板块。
With interest rates on the rise and a dramatically improved economic landscape, is it all turning up roses for these bank stocks? Let's talk about it with Mike Mayo, senior banking analyst at Wells Fargo Securities and the top large cap banks analyst on the street. Mike, always good to see you. Welcome. Banks are awash in cash. Is that because people's savings rates have gone up? They have gotten stimulus money, they have gotten unemployment cash, and they've put it in the bank to save?
Well, I'll tell you, the deposit growth at the largest banks has been at a record pace, and a lot of that is due to digital banking. So you're seeing this surge in deposits without much loan growth. So the ratio of deposits, what banks have available to lend, to actual loans is the lowest level in almost half a century. So the banks are willing and able to lend as the economy recovers, and we think loan demand will pick up in a few quarters.
But the loan demand.
那主持人问他说，现在为什么美国这些银行有这么多的现金啊？他们充斥着现金。那他说，现在美国这个存款增长达到了创历史记录的这个速度。那为什么呢？是由于这个数字银行业务的兴起同时呢，美国这些银行的贷款却没有太多的增长。那就他觉得随着这个美国经济的恢复，银行现在是愿意并且有能力放贷。同时他觉得美国人民对贷款的需求将在未来几个季度内回升。
Man just isn't there right now, and the banks, let's just put it mildly, they are not exactly paying a ton of money for those deposits, are they?
Well, look at what the impact has been on the banks. The year-over-year decline in the first quarter, what's called the net interest margin, it was the biggest decline in a century, and that's as a result of the lower interest rate. So as the economy and banks come out of this low-rate environment, banks should be among the biggest beneficiaries.
So banks should.
那主持人问他，银行会不会交很多的钱给这些存款因为现在很多人存款没有什么人那个借贷。那他说，因为现在美国利率很低嘛，所以 Q1 美国这些银行他们的第一季度的这个净利息收益率在下降这是一个世纪以来最大的下降。那他觉得未来美联储升息之后，银行将会是受益板块。
Should be a big beneficiary of that. Should banks be a big beneficiary of rising inflation if it doesn't rise too much too fast?
Absolutely. We're going from non-existent inflation and a little bit of higher interest rates, a more normal yield curve would go a long way. In fact, Tyler, I would say, let me just sum up, because you talked about how well the bank stocks have performed. We think bank stocks have a long way to go. This is a great time to be a bullish bank investor. I'll sum it up as the 5 C's. One of those C's is the curve or yield curve, as you're already talking about. Another C would be credit quality is improving much faster than many had expected. The third C would be capital markets, which are stronger for longer. The fourth C is the return of capital and the expectations of higher dividend payouts. That should happen later this year. And the fifth C is what gets me excited, having covered the industry for 3 decades. That would be costs. And, Tyler, I will give you the conclusion of our bank conference this week before it even takes place, before the 25 bank CEOs even present. The conclusion is, with a little bit of help from Plato, necessity is the mother of invention. Banks are headed toward record efficiency, and that's because banks have no choice competing against big tech and big retail and non-banks with less regulation, and that's enabled at the banks by a tech revolution. And the pandemic turbocharged that ability, both in the front office and the back office. So, Tyler, it's not just about the yield curve and higher interest rates. It's also about this really a once-in-a-lifetime implementation of tech that should take efficiency toward record levels.
那主持人问他说，你觉得银行会在通胀中受益吗？那他觉得现在是最好的时间来买入银行。他觉得银行的股票还有很多的空间可以向上涨。那他给出了5个理由，第一个是收益曲线的问题因为我们觉得未来会加息，还有就是信用的质量，现在的信用质量比较高，然后还有就是资本市场他觉得这个美国的资本市场会很长久并且很强。 那同时还有就是资本回报，而且他认为今年晚些时候这些银行的分红会提高。然后最后就是成本这些银行他们没有什么成本，尤其是对大宗商品来说没有说很受到这些商品价格提高的坏的影响。同时他觉得银行正朝着创历史记录的效率而迈进，因为这个疫情使银行发生了技术革命这一辈子才会发生一次的这种技术改革。那这些技术改革将会使银行的效率提高到创历史记录的水平。
You know, Mike, the interesting thing about that is that it implies some talent and headcount issues that all industries are starting to deal with. In banking, it's interesting because they're not just facing it for their hourly workers. In Bank of America today, so they're going to a $25 minimum wage by 2025, but they could be facing it at the top earning food chain as well, where you have people competed away to those other industries that you mentioned.
Absolutely. One of the challenges for banks is to recruit technologists from Silicon Valley. But the advantage of banks is they have customers, they have a banking charter, and they have the ability to impact 10 or 20 or 30 million customers with their efforts. So certainly the battle between Silicon Valley and the banking industry, both friend and foe when you talk about technology at banks.
Job reductions over a decade, 100,000 to 200,000. That sounds like a lot, but over a decade, it sure doesn't sound like a lot. So you're really not predicting massive layoffs in the banking industry, or are you? Number one. Number two, what about branches? Is that trend going to continue where branches are going to keep closing?
Well, we released a report in the last week forecasting up to 200,000 less jobs among U.S. banks. We expect the biggest decline in banking jobs in history. And that's due to the automation in the back office and the digitization in the front office. And Tyler, that certainly stems from expectations for a lot less branches and a lot less people per branch. And you're going to see a lot more self-help, automated tools inside the branches. Now, the jobs that should be growing in the banking industry, anything related to technology or advice both on the retail and the wholesale side, that should continue to grow as banks continue to automate the lower paying jobs. Having said that, That is noteworthy. Bank America today highlighted they will pay a $25 minimum wage by 2025. So while the absolute number of jobs should be reduced, we actually think the average salary per employee will continue to increase.
Mike Mayo.
那今天美国银行说，他们要在2025年之前使他们所有员工的最低工资上升至$25每一个小时。主持人问他说：“你觉得这些银行分行会继续关闭吗？”那这个富国银行的人，他现在的这个预期认为，在未来的12年内，美国的银行产业将会使20万人丢失工作20万人。那为什么呢？因为就是这个科技化、科技改革以后银行的后台都是自动化前台数字化前台数字化之后就不需要人了，所以他觉得银行会关闭很多的分行，同时每一个分行里面需要工作的员工也会减少因为都被科技给代替了。那在银行里面反而什么样的人会增多呢？第一就是技术人员，因为需要科技嘛。第二就是顾问就是可能卖他们这些产品的投资理财产品的这种顾问会多，所以他觉得银行这个板块是需要的人越来越少，但是需要的人才越来越多，高质量的人比较难找一些的人，所以呢，他们也是这个每小时最低工资有一个上升。那我们来看这个 Laffer Tangler Investment 的首席投资官 Nancy Tangler。他怎么看他最喜欢的这几个个股，同时这个板块可选择消费品。
So listen, let's talk about I think Amazon is one of your favorite names right now. This whole theme is one of your favorites. So explain a little bit where you see the opportunity here.
Well, so, you've heard this ad nauseum, but the consumer is in fabulous shape. It's not just the transfer payments, but it's also the balance sheet. And that has been happening over the last 10, 15 years, where debt's been paid down by the consumer and asset prices obviously are up, housing as well. So we think the spending boom continues, and we may see a slight shift from goods to services, but goods are not going away. And so Amazon's a stock that sort of straddles e-commerce and some physical physical shopping. You saw today from Walmart what being in both spaces can do up against really difficult comps. Beat the numbers, raise guidance. E-commerce continues to thrive there as well. So we actually like both these names, but we've been adding to Amazon. It's done nothing for almost a year, since late summer anyway. And so this is a stock on a valuation basis that is compelling. They've borrowed a lot of money at very low rates, and they've raised expectations for free cash flow.
Quick question.
那主持人问他说：“你最喜欢的股票为什么现在是亚马逊？”他最喜欢亚马逊。那他说，在过去的10年到15年内，非选择消费品这个行业一直在偿还债务啊。那他觉得这个消费热潮继续。那同时他也承认，也许会有一些钱从商品购买转入到服务类，因为重启了，大家要出去享受一些服务啊，看电影什么的，旅游啊。但是呢，他觉得整体对这个板块影响不大，就是非选择消费品。那他说亚马逊很厉害的地方就是它不光是一个电商，它还有实体购物，对吧？有这个 Amazon Fresh 这种实体超市。那他觉得沃尔玛和亚马逊比较像，因为沃尔玛也有虚拟购物，也有这个电商，当然沃尔玛它主要是做实体啊。那沃尔玛今天给出的这个财报非常的棒，同时它也上升了今年这个指引。他觉得现在亚马逊的这个估值比较有趣，比较低。我们也看到了，1年的时间，亚马逊的股票价格没动，横盘啊。而且他觉得亚马逊现在用很低的利率接了很多很健康的债务，所以他很看好亚马逊。同时，他觉得亚马逊很有可能会提高这个对自由现金流的这个期望值。
Quick question before we move away from Amazon. What would you think as a shareholder about their possible investment in MGM, especially the price that they're rumored to be paying, which is pretty steep?
Well, yes, it is steep, but this is a company with a ton of cash, and I think they'd rather buy MGM than pay a dividend, though as a shareholder, I'd rather they pay a dividend. So they needed to make a big acquisition. It would lower the cost of content for them. And I find it super intriguing, especially in light of the AT&T Discovery deal. So I think they're on the right track. This is what Jeff Bezos, I believe, freed himself up to do, be strategic and thoughtful. And we know that he likes this space, and we know that streaming is going to continue to be a compelling part of most people's entertainment budget.
It's interesting you say you'd rather have them pay a dividend. Why is that? Because presumably they think they can invest those cash flows internally at much higher rates than whatever they might be able to pay out. And it's not tax efficient, especially these days, right?
Exactly right. I think that one of my big worries about the market is the potential policy mistakes we may see out of DC, and that is not just dividend or income taxes going up, which will raise the tax on dividends, but capital gains taxes going up to almost usurious levels, if you ask me.
Right. So that being the case, why would you want Amazon to pay a dividend?
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you, Kelly. Yeah, well, as an investor, I mean, many investors live off the income in their portfolios. So if you get a dividend and dividend growth, think of Apple. I mean, there was a time in 2013-14 when they were yielding above the 10-year, and the 10-year was yielding in the almost 3% level range. So as for retail investors, dividends, if there's enough cash flow, are better and more sustainable than share buybacks, though I'm not opposed to share buybacks. But I think just for individuals who are investing in the stock, it's a way to get some of your return up front.
Right. It would be, so it's kind of a catalyst for gains if they were to go in that direction. Maybe we can see that coming out of the AT&T trade again today. The idea that
那主持人问他说：“你怎么看现在亚马逊可能要买这个 MGM 电影制片厂？同时现在给出来的这个价格是传言的这个价格是比较高的。那他觉得这个亚马逊现在有很多的现金啊，他要把这个现金花出去，所以亚马逊宁愿收购这个 MGM 电影制片厂，也不愿意去给这个股民支付股息啊。但是他觉得这个收购还是很重要的，因为我们知道这个亚马逊也有这个网络电视的这个服务，所以他如果收购了这个电影制片厂之后，他产出的一些电影的成本就会下降啊。同时现在也是跟随着一个很大的事件，关于这个网络直播的事件，就是 AT&T 它下面的这个华纳媒体和发现频道他们合并了这个事儿啊，现在也都是大家想要去抢这块肉来吃，所以他认为这个网络电视将继续成为人民娱乐预算的一个重要的组成部分。那主持人问他说：“你为什么想让亚马逊分红？你为什么喜欢分红？” 那当然，现在我们知道华盛顿现在拜登上来，华盛顿可能会提高这个资本利得税和个人所得税。所以这个可能对分红的这个税收会增加啊。但是他说他喜欢分红，是因为很多投资者他们年纪比较大，他们可能是靠吃分红来生活啊。同时他认为这个公司发分红比他们直接回购自己的股票更有可持续性。
We could touch on, I know, for example, you mentioned stock buybacks, and you do think that's an important source under the whole stock market. But since we've been talking Amazon, your thoughts on Apple are a little bit different here. You know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not a name you'd be picking up on what some would say is another opportunity where it hasn't done much lately.
You're right. It has not. But we were buying the stock at much lower PE levels, much lower relative price to sales ratio levels. And we think a lot of the good news at the current PE is priced in. So we have been net sellers for the last 18 months. We sold about 60% of our holdings. We still own a significant amount in our portfolios. It's about a 3% weighting across the board, but it was 5, 6 and would have gone to 10 if we hadn't trimmed it. So we think much of that story has played out. We get the whole super cycle in services, but that was important when the stock was trading, you know, at a 9 multiple. Those things were not priced in. And so we are shifting a little bit to some new software names, which I can't talk about because we just purchased them this morning.
Well,
主持人问他说你怎么看苹果呢？他说他不看好苹果啊，他不看好苹果，他觉得现在股价太高，估值太高，这些苹果的好新闻全部都已经在股价中显现。他在过去的18个月卖出了他们机构60%的苹果持仓，他们现在机构里面的投资组合里面只有3%的苹果啊，所以他们现在把这些钱拿来买什么呢？他们买一些比较新型的一些软件公司，那这边他不能说是哪几个，因为他们今天刚刚买。
We'll give it a few days, maybe, and then we'll ask. Nancy, let me just circle back to what we started with at the beginning here before I let you go. So this idea of kind of these companies that can bridge both the physical and the digital shopping experience for the post-pandemic consumer. Are there any other plays in that space other than Amazon that you'd recommend here?
Definitely. Yes, Kelly. We like Starbucks and Chipotle on the restaurant side. McDonald's has begun to show life. We own all 3 of those, and they're pretty major holdings. We're pretty significantly overweight consumer discretionary. I actually think Home Depot has done a very good job. Another name that we own. It didn't get much of a response today, but the stock's up materially, and it's still attractive, and the housing trade is not over. They've done a good job with digital, as have Starbucks, as I mentioned, Chipotle, and McDonald's. So we like all of those names in the consumer discretionary space.
Yeah,
a lot.
And to think that Home Depot might not be done yet after some of the gains that it's made. Always such great thoughts, Nancy. We appreciate it. Thank you.
那主持人问他说，除了这个亚马逊，你还喜欢什么？在这个可选的消费品板块，那他说星巴克，Chipotle， 这是一个墨西哥饭店。麦当劳、加德堡、Home Depot 就是他觉得这个建商这个房屋方面还没有结束，这个还能向上涨。来看一下高盛的这个高级投资策略师 Abby Joseph Cohen 怎么看现在的这个股市。
What is your sense of valuations right now? We're going through a huge rotation. Just from a kind of stability, financial stability point of view, do you think we're starting to get a little frothy here?
The valuations clearly are at very high percentiles relative to history. The only valuations that are not are things like equity risk premium and so on that key off of inflation and interest rates. And as you've done such a great job discussing the fact that inflation and interest rates are on the way up, I think we have to recognize that returns overall in the U.S. equity market from this point will be very modest and perhaps volatile compared to what we've enjoyed, especially over the last 12 to 15 months. But I think that there is a rotation going on. Investors are looking at where earnings growth will be coming from. And what appeals to me, quite frankly, is that investors are acting like investors again. There's less emphasis on momentum, and there's more emphasis on relative valuation and which of the companies that have the strongest cash flow growth and are investing that cash flow for longer term purposes, including CapEx, including basic research, because those are the companies that will be leadership companies over the next handful of years.
那主持人问他说：“你看现在股市是不是有这个泡沫啊？越来越大了啊，这泡沫。”那他说现在股市中的这个估值确实是历史中的高位啊，但是呢，现在这个风险溢价却很低，因为我们预期这个要升息。然后他觉得美国股市的收益在未来十几个月将会比较一般，同时会比较颠簸啊。他同意现在这个资金的板块流动还在继续，从成长股和科技股向经济重启股的这个流动。然后他说现在投资者开始去找真正有基本面的公司了，去找这种有利润的公司，有盈利的公司，有盈利成长的公司。那他说现在投资者的做法再次看起来像投资者了。说咱们去年不像投资者他说现在这个投资者对这个股票的动能不再那么重视，然而我们更重视的是这个相对的估值。那他说什么样的公司会表现很好呢？就是这种有很大很强现金流的公司，同时他们愿意把现金流花来研究和他们自己本身的这个资本支出这样的公司将在未来几年成为领导公司。好吧，那最近几期我们也看到很多华尔街的投行出来说银行金融这个板块很多的投行都在里面投然后我们也看到这个工业还有就是材料能源，这两个也有人说，但是我觉得很危险然后还有就是可选择消费品，现在也是经济重启嘛。那我们现在觉得可选择消费品吓人的地方就是里面是靠两三个公司带队，他们的市值太高了，相比其他公司他们的市值就相当于大象和蚂蚁，所以这些经济重启股他们就算表现好也很难在板块的表现中看出就像昨天特斯拉跌了，它整个板块照样跌对吧？所以我也觉得是视频前面讲这个标普500的可选择消费品个股权重相等的这个 ETF很有趣，能更好的显现出美国这个经济重启的步伐。好吧，这是北美流氓，希望这期视频对你有所帮助。如果你还没有订阅，不要忘记点赞、订阅、打开小铃铛。我们明天见，拜拜。